So I think we have time for a question or two.
If I understood correctly, you're describing God as nature. And if that's the case, why call it God and not nature? And if that's not the case, can you explain the difference?
Good question. The short answer is that I wrote a long book on the topic called God Revised. Two things. For me, God is not an idea or an artifact, but God is an experience. It's the experience of transcendence. The experience of being connected, as I say, to all that is present in our world, as well as all that is past and all that is possible. It's an experience. So I think it's an important experience for every human being. The more important question, I think, is the second part of your question is why call that God? So there are two reasons. I'm working on the Copernican principle that you can take a fixed notion, say the idea of the solar system as Earth-centered, and over time, change people's understandings of it. So either people like me abdicate the word God to mostly what I would describe as the religious right, who are using it as a bludgeon to create enormous harm in this world. Or I contest them and say, your idea of God is way out of date. We need a different understanding of God. So there's that political piece, which is one reason that I continue to use the word God. The other is, what else are you going to use?
Nature?
Nature, as we currently understand it, is typically focused on the material world. So, two words that often get used in lieu of God is spirit of life or ground of being. Those two terms kind of commit the dualist fault that religions have been arguing about for centuries. It's the argument between Aristotle and Plato, whether the real stuff in the world is the material world and everything else is just kind of an imagination, or whether the real stuff is the eternal stuff and matter is a kind of temporary creation. The Christians went with the latter, with the Platonic view. But I think the idea that we fall in line with the scientists and say the only thing that exists is stuff that you can essentially put under a microscope is highly problematic for a bunch of reasons. Richard Dawkins wrote a book called Freedom Evolves, in which he tried to argue that you could get free will out of a completely determined universe. And in fact, even his biggest fans, Galen Strawson, his philosophers, one of them, said he did not succeed. So I think the idea of the earth, either as nature as divine or nature as the only thing that exists, is problematic for a number of reasons. So for now, I'm going to continue to use the word God. Unless somebody comes up with a better idea, I'm open.
Thanks so much. I have a question about gender.
Mm-hmm.
We heard so much yesterday about the extent to which power lies with men in the community that you come from. And so can you speak at all to sort of what motivates, maybe in a very general sense, and obviously you can't generalize, but like, it seems that there's differences in the reasons why men tend to leave insular communities versus women, especially since there are positions of power that men can occupy and have a life in that way. Do you see any differences in terms of what motivated you to leave based on your gender from, let's say, girls and women that you might know who had a very different experience?
Good question. It's worth remembering that Western culture generally and Western religious traditions in particular were created of men, by men, and for men. And they were built from the ground up to establish male authority and to defend it from all comers, including women, children, anyone else. And a lot of what we heard about yesterday was the struggle of the patriarchy to defend itself. And it's really good at it because it's solidly in place and has been there for a long time. Ironically, what led me even to walk out the door was precisely the issue you brought up. I was serving in a Mennonite congregation as a part of my field work when I was in seminary, not a Mennonite seminary. And I was asked to be part of, to lead a group to address the question of whether women could serve on the board of trustees. The question had kept coming up and, you know, the guys kept putting it down, but at some point they said, okay, maybe we ought to actually think about this. So the bishop came to me and said, would you be willing to lead this group? And I said, I will on two conditions. One is that we appoint 7 people. You pick 3 who you think will defend the status quo. I will pick 3 who I think would be open to change. And if I get this group to make a unanimous recommendation to you, you agree to accept. He said, fine. So a year and a half went by, we went through this big long study process, consulting, yada, yada. And in the end, we had a proposal that wouldn't mandate women on the board of trustees, but created a process that could, at some point, lead to that. We presented it to him, and he said, no, we're not going to do that. And that's a point at which I said, I'm out. I simply can't. If the institution is that impermeable to change, it's not a place that I can live. So I think one of the reasons that I spend as much time as I do talking about the issue of gender, and it's one of the key elements of my work at the Council on Foreign Relations, is because I think religion has been such a powerful ally of the patriarchy. And my wife and I occasionally bat around the question of whether or not a non-patriarchal version of the legacy of religious traditions is even a concept that you can wrap your head around. If God is male, and the prophets are male, and the kind of heads of the church are male, what would it look like to have a kind of gender-neutral religious tradition? I mean, can you even conceive of where you would need to get to for that to be different? For myself, the answer is I can't see that space, which is why I'm no longer a Christian. But I do think that gender lies at the heart of all of our problems. You solve the gender problem, all the other problems more or less go away.
To what extent did your education, particularly your higher education, make you more restless about the men-led life you really knew?
I would say it's almost completely responsible for my restlessness. Which is to say, in my experience, the only way to keep me cloistered would be to take away all my books. And that started very early. I mean, when we moved to Arkansas, because my parents wouldn't let me do other things. I mean, they wouldn't let me go play with my classmates at their homes after school because they were afraid I'd, watch television or something. We went to the library. And we went to the library so often and took so many books home that after a couple of years, they named us the Library Family of the Year. But I would read. I read all of the Hardy Boys. I read all of Nancy Drew. You know, and I imagined what it would be like to be as adventurous as the Hardy Boys and as plucky as Nancy Drew. More poetry. There's a line in a Ron Kirky poem titled Nancy Drew. The poem is titled Nancy Drew. And the line goes like this. Locked in an abandoned farmhouse, Nancy fashions a radio out of a muffin and a shoelace. I love that. I was fascinated by flying, and I read every book about airplanes and flying as I could, and imagined being in the Air Force. So the idea that my life could be different than the life I had experienced started very early. And I would say the process of wrestling intellectually with the tradition and its epistemology, its understanding of how you know what you most truly know, came here at Franklin Marshall College, over in what is now Disler House in the Classics Department, reading ancient Greek philosophy and beginning to grapple with the idea that human ways of thinking about the world are human ways of thinking about the world. And that people in different times gather up whatever understandings and rituals and stories kind of enable them to make sense of it. And as I then went to seminary and learned how religious traditions develop, I'm like, this is just a natural adaptation that human beings make. And to take one adaptation, Christianity for example, and say, that is the whole truth for all time, it makes no sense. So education was vitally important to me.
Did your family understand the danger of sending you off to college?
Yes, although I think just abstractly. My father didn't finish high school. He got his GED many years later. My mother went to part of one semester of college at what was then Eastern Mennonite College. But there were, my mother has not spoken to me about this. My guess is that there was some trauma in her upbringing that posed some real issues at that stage in her life. So when I turned 16, my parents gave me a car, a used car, a 1967 Ford Mustang, which is a great car, by the way. And they said, we're finished. We're done. If you want to go to college, great. It's on you. If you want to, work for Dad, he was a contractor, carpenter, cabinet maker. That's great. If you want to do something else, no worries. But you're on your own. So there was no sense that education was a path I should pursue, but I didn't have the same obstacles in front of me, at least religious obstacles. There were practical challenges, being on your own at 16. But it's one of the reasons that I stayed in school for as long as I did, is because a deep, deep hunger to figure out, so if the way of thinking and living that I grew up with isn't the one true way, what's the way that's true for me? And how can I ensure that I don't make the same mistakes that I think my parents and family of origin did? How are we doing?
We're doing good
Okay.
so far. I have a question I would like to ask because I keep getting it asked, which is, what's the difference between religion and culture? And specifically in my context, Amish, how do you define or separate the religious part and the culture part?
To me, religion has to do with transcendence. let me be more precise. Spirituality has to do with transcendence. It's the experience of being connected to what is larger than ourselves. Transcend means to move beyond. It's to move beyond the narrow confines of our own personal experience and try to engage the experience of other people and the experience of the universe. So this feeling of being a part, not just of a family or even a nation, but a kind of part of everything, that we are children of the cosmos. That sense of transcendence, of being one with the universe, many ways to describe it, that sense to me is at the heart of what spirituality is about. And that experience, I think, has implications. As I have a sense that I'm a part of everything, I also feel that everything is a part of me. That my life as I know it is a gift to me from the people and world around me, and that I owe something back in return. So that relationship of reciprocity lies at the heart of how I understand my ethical commitments. So if a group of people kind of get together at some point and think about not just how they individually are going to respond to the gift and the demand, but how they're going to work together to do that. How are they going to remind each other of what it means to be a responsible citizen, a responsible part of this earth community? Well, maybe we'll tell some stories. Maybe we'll sing some songs. You begin to develop the traditions of meeting, of gathering, of symbol, story, prayer, whatever, that develop what becomes religion. So spirituality is the individual experience which, when taken seriously within a group of people, eventually will develop into a religious tradition. It doesn't matter whether you eat spaghetti bolognese or choux-fly pie. Those are cultural elements. They may serve, in some cases, a religious function. I mean, bread and wine obviously serve a religious function in the Christian tradition. But culture is dealing with sort of the practicalities of everyday life and how you do what you do. Religion is about what your life means, what your purpose in life is, and how you remind yourself of your commitments. So I think they're very different.
Thank you so much.
I was curious, you had talked a little bit about the struggle related to freedom. And I'm really interested in hearing more about that because I believe the fear of freedom also is one of the bludgeons along with God that is used to keep people in various oppressed positions. And I'm thinking there have been some really interesting pieces written about what happens when people are given freedom and their inability, the terror that brings out.
I think you're exactly right. If you're paying attention, freedom is quite terrifying. And both the freedom to live your own life, my wife works a lot with, or has in the past, with victims of sex trafficking and with organizations that rescue mostly women, but some young men who have been trafficked. And the recidivism rate is extremely high, in part because being out of the life is a completely unknown world. Unless there's someone there to help map the journey and kind of walk alongside the person, the chances are that the known, even if it's terrible, is safer than the unknown, even if it's promising. So I think that's that dynamic is why a lot of people stay put. I think one reason a lot of people stay put religiously is that it's exceedingly difficult work to have to think for yourself about what to believe and how to live, and most people simply don't want to do it. And to Marcy's point yesterday, fewer and fewer young people in this country are being educated to the point that they can actually think about these things. So it's just a lot easier to, put up with whatever you have to put up with to be part of kind of one of the traditional religious groups. But I also should say that I have a lot of respect for people who are clear that they are part of a particular religious community, even if it stands for some things they don't necessarily agree with, because they value the community. And I think the sense of community, the sense of identity, the sense of purpose, the sense of discipline, being able to collaborate with other people to make the world a better place, I think those are all vital things, even if the community doesn't stand for everything that it should stand for. So I'm open to people who say, I don't believe everything that my church stands for, but it's really important to me and I want my kids to grow up in a certain environment. There are a lot of good options. The tradition I'm now in is a possibility, but it's very small, relatively speaking. I mean, we are, a footnote on an asterisk on the, there are a quarter as many Unitarian Universalists as there are Amish. So there you go. It's a very small tradition. But there just aren't a lot of good options. You either have to be traditionally religious or kind of nothing. And that's not a good place to be. Thank you.
I really enjoyed your talk. Even though we come from different traditions, or similar but different, I really resonate with your journey. I went through much of the same searching, basically distilling the questions right down to who is God? Is there a God? Where do my prayers go? That sort of thing. And so I really appreciate your honesty and your sharing of your journey. And I like to think of God as the universe and everything in it, or as eternity or infinity. That's how hard I find God is to understand.
Thank you for that. And I guess I should add one thing about my language about God and my view of God. The one thing that materialist views of God have difficulty dealing with is the question of where possibilities come from. And it's also philosophically a difficult question. The possibilities for what could happen to each of us even in the next 10 minutes are manifold. But only one of those possibilities will turn out to happen. What happens to the other ones? They are real possibilities, but yet they don't actually exist, and then they don't happen. So anyway, philosophers have run around this mulberry bush a long time and have basically come up with not much. But my view is that when you're talking about transcendence, when you're talking about the experience of all that is present in our life and world, as well as all that is past, and perhaps most importantly, all that is possible. That last part, to me, is the most vitally important part. is the presence of the divine in this world exists as the presence of possibility. So if you would force me to choose one word to substitute for the word God, I would choose the word possibility. That God exists as the possibility for transformation, for redemption, even in the most difficult and dire circumstances. And that sense of possibility that, yes, the world's a mess, but it's a beautiful day. And it's possible that things can change. The world can change, we can change, and that the future can be better. And that possibility is what gets me out of bed every morning. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Galen. It's been an honor to have you here. I really appreciate that you came, and I just wanted everybody to know that we have a 30-minute break, I believe, and Galen will be here to with us. And feel free to ask some questions one-on-one if you have questions. And Sarah Hayter will be our next speaker. We'll be back at 11:05 for Sarah.